In this section, we will get started working with Python code. First, we will learn about the differences between Python 2 and Python 3. Currently, Python version 3 is the latest version of Python. Version 2 is still pretty frequently used in terms of legacy systems support. We will run through a simple beginner coding exercise of writing a Hello World program with Python. Whenever you are learning a new language, it is a tradition to first learn how to output Hello World to the console. I will walk you through how to do this step by step. Then there is a coding exercise where you will do it by yourself to ensure that you retain the information. Then we will learn about variables. Variables are the building blocks of computer science, and we will go over the types of variables that we have available to us when programming in Python. Next, we will learn about the console in PyCharm, the window that the program output is printed to. The console is an important feature of any IDE, and understanding how to work with it to view program output and help debug the program is essential. To control the flow of execution of the code that we type, we use what are called conditional statements. One of the most famous examples of a conditional statement in computer programming is the if statement. We will learn about each of the conditional statements that Python gives us access to. Then we will learn about loops. When we want to execute a block of code repeatedly, we use a loop. We will learn about the various types of loops that Python gives us access to, and when each is useful when programming. After that, we will learn about variable scope. Put simply, variable scope means that depending on the location of a variable in the code file, it could have a different meaning within the program. We will learn what local and global scope are, and how to avoid some beginner pitfalls when working with these concepts. Next, we will learn about namespaces and modules. When writing code, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. There are several modules that we can import into our code to add common functionality, without having to write it ourselves from the ground up. Then we will learn about comments. Comments are non-executable lines of code that allow us to make notes for ourselves or other developers. They are a great way to explain the confusing parts of our code, or mark spots we plan on coming back to and cleaning up at a later date. After that, we will learn about the basics of working with functions in Python. A function is a reusable block of code, and all programmers need to know how to write functions. Without functions, our code would quickly become a mess that is hard to manage. Next, we will learn the basics of errors. What is an error? What are the different types of errors? We will answer these questions and more in the lecture video on errors. Then we will learn about the basic syntax for Python code. Syntax just means the rules of a programming language, so this video will cover basic rules that we need to follow when writing code in the Python programming language. Next, we will learn about the modulus operator. We will learn what it does and the role that it plays in computer programming. Finally, we will run through some of the keywords that we have available to us when working in Python to give us a better understanding of the built-in functionality we have at our disposal when writing Python code. In the next lecture, we will compare and contrast the differences between Python version 2 and Python version 3. In this lecture, we will learn about the differences between Python 2 and Python 3. Okay, so the first question you're probably wondering is if there are two versions of the language, why would you ever want to use the older one? Imagine that you get a job at a company that has been around for a long time, and their system uses Python 2. The developers programmed it back in 2004, and the company has been using it since then. Python 3 won't do you any good in that situation, and the company may not have plans to update their system to Python 3. Or perhaps you join their company, and they are in the middle of upgrading their system from Python 2 to Python 3. Knowing both Python 2 and Python 3 would be a great benefit to you in that case. Just a heads up, this course will focus on Python 3, as that is the latest version, and companies have been transitioning to Python 3. Year after year, the number of companies using Python 2 decreases, and the number using Python 3 has been climbing. Python 2 is the legacy version of Python. Many of the older libraries that were built for Python 2 are not compatible with Python 3. In other words, they are not forwards compatible. In Python 2, string values are stored as ASCII by default. Also, print is a statement, not a function, in Python 2. Python 3 is the newer version of Python. Many developers creating libraries create them only for Python 3, and not for Python 2. In Python 3, strings are stored as Unicode by default. Also, print is a function, not a statement, in Python 3. In the next lecture, we will learn how to print Hello World in Python. In this lecture, we will learn how to write a Hello World program using Python. A tradition in computer programming is that whenever a programmer is learning a new language, the first thing that they learn to do is print Hello World to the console. In Python, this is quite simple. First, we type the print function, which is the word print, followed by a set of opening and closing parentheses. This function is responsible for printing output to the console in Python, and is one of the most common functions that you will use when writing Python code. Inside of the parentheses, we type the string we would like to output to the console. In this case, that will be Hello World. Then we will run the code by hitting the Run button. As you can see, the result is that Hello World was printed to the PyCharm console. Note that strings in Python can be surrounded in double quotes or single quotes. Both will yield the same result. Python is different from languages like C# and Java in that it treats single quoted strings the same as double quoted strings. In C# and Java, single quotes are used for characters, but not strings. So we could change the double quotes to single quotes. Then we will run the code again. As you can see, the result is that the string Hello World was logged to the console, just like it was in the last example. For those of you with prior programming experience, this is probably one of the easiest programs you have ever written. If this is the first time you've ever wrote code, this may still seem a tad confusing. Just in case, I've added a small hands-on coding exercise where you will put the skills you just learned to the test. Next up is the Hello World coding exercise. In this lecture, we will go over the answer to the coding exercise we just worked on. We start out given the function Hello World, and need to fill it with code that will output the string Hello World to the console. If you followed along with the video right before the coding exercise, this should be pretty easy. Inside of the function, we just need to use Python's print function and pass in the string Hello World. In the next lecture, we will learn about variables in Python. In this lecture, we will learn about variables in Python. Variables store data in computer programs. Each variable consists of two things, a type and a value. Every language has variables, but there are slight differences in the rules for each language. These rules are what we refer to as the syntax of the programming language. The basic data types in Python are integers, floats, booleans, and strings. To see the value of a variable, we can use the equal sign. In programming, the equal sign is also referred to as the assignment operator, since it is used to assign a value to a variable. In this example, we assign the variable x a value of 2. Notice that first comes the name of the variable, then the equal sign, and then the value of 2 on the right. Also notice that unlike other programming languages, lines of code are not ended with semicolons. One important point to note about Python is that we do not explicitly specify the type of variable before the name. This means that Python is a dynamically typed language, unlike languages like Java and C# that are statically typed. Python has some rules for how we can name variables. A variable can contain the following characters: letters, the underscore, and numbers. One important point to note is that names cannot start with a digit. Also, names can start with a capital letter, but it is against Python style guidelines. It is widely accepted in the community that variables should be lowercase and either separated by underscores or using camel case. Camel case is when we have a multi-word variable name, so we start off each word with a capital letter and then smash each word into one big word without spaces. For example, let's say we want to name our variable. For starters, variables cannot contain spaces. But if we just remove the spaces, it will be really hard to see where each word starts and stops, and the next word begins. To separate the words, we start each new word off with a capital letter. That is an example of a variable name in camel case. The other way that some people like to separate words is keeping all of the letters lowercase, and using underscores between each word. When naming variables, it is important to give variables meaningful names. For example, if you have a variable that will store a price of $5, instead of typing x equals 5, we could name the variable price and type price equals 5 instead. A Boolean variable can have one of two values, true and false. For example, we could have a variable t that stores a value of true. Note that true starts with a capital T in Python. This is different than other programming languages, where the T for true is lowercase. Another example of a Boolean variable is if we have a variable named f set to a value of false. Python also supports a text data type, the string. A string value is a sequence of characters within quotes. Strings can go inside of single quotes, double quotes, or even triple quotes. Python also supports number variables. An integer, or int for short, can be a positive or negative whole number or zero. All of the following are examples of integer variables in Python. A floating point number, or float, is an arithmetic type that has a decimal point. It can be positive or negative. Variables are the building blocks of computer programs. Throughout this course, we will be using variables extensively as we write code. In the next lecture, we will learn about the console.